Okay, this is only a short presentation of our work. We hope that the museum and our exhibition as well can reopen in the next weeks. In that case, we are all more than welcome here in Turin. So let's start with the introduction of the seminar. I would like to highlight the main issue we would like to discuss with all of you today, starting from your different perspectives, your different point of view, your different research and practical experiences on urban China. In this introduction, I will quickly go through 4 main points. The first point is the strong link between the exhibition and our research on Chinese new towns started in 2015. The research was coordinated by Michele Bonino, Angelo Sampieri and me, and involved scholars from the École Polytechnique Fédérale of Lausanne in Switzerland, the Tsinghua University of Beijing, in particular Liu Jian, and prospect photographers of Milan, in particular Samuele Pellecchia. Although the research has formally ended, it's still ongoing. The exhibition China Goes Urban is a step in our research path that we are still continuing. Of course, our research was in the field until more or less 1 year ago, and then became a remote research not without frustrations. The second point is, of course, the topic of our research, Chinese urbanization and how to deal with it. A lot of scholars, both Chinese scholars and Western scholars, consider Chinese urbanization like a big enigma. The problem, I guess, is the complexity of Chinese urbanization and the difficulty to avoid shortcuts and mainstream views, seeing urban China as an exception, an exaggeration, and a flaw. It seems to us that this difficulty arises also, and perhaps above all, from the interpretative models, from the idea of the city, from the conceptual schemes and frames we have in our minds, and which in many ways seem to be unable not only to understand Chinese New City, because they were born in the Western world to describe the Western city, but also to understand the contemporary city, not only in China, but all over the world, because they are models, ideas, schemes, and frames born in the past centuries. In short, it seemed to us that the enigma of urban China is the enigma of the urban itself. And for a certain degree, our research on Chinese new towns is a research on the contemporary urban world that appears to us without meaning, incomprehensible when traditional categories are adopted. So the third point is in which way we have tried to manage our research, which are the moves we have done and we continue to do to face Chinese urbanization. In general terms, we try to reposition our vision and redescribe what we see. To do this, we have experimented a sort of combination and mix between different methods and different sources, including maps, images, photos, video, drawings, fieldworks, observation, and so on. All of them are used not only to describe and to show in the exhibition urban realities, but as tool to investigate, to question, to move our views. At the same time, we try to follow a multiplicity of urban trajectories, starting from 4 specific new towns that are Tongzhou, new town located in the eastern expansion of Beijing, Zhaoqing, new area located on the western border of the Pearl River Delta, Jiandong, new district near Zhengzhou in Henan province, Lanchun, new area in Gansu province, where the state is building a new town to promote growth and attract investment. So we start from this new town, but then we try to open them in order to go behind the boundaries, not only physical boundaries, of course, but also conceptual ones. And we try to follow their ability to be connected to other spaces, to other issues and other questions of today's urbanization. In this way, these 4 new towns are used as both case studies and points of view to observe and question the features of the contemporary urban world, starting from China but going behind it. So we use Chinese New Town as a lens, as a way of seeing, using an expression of John Berger, critically discussed in an article by Hilary Angelo, so as an epistemological framework through which open our minds and our views. The last point is that we start, as I have already said, from this new town, or better still, we see from this new town, and seeing from these 4 new towns, we have identified 4 main issues that appear to us in search for new meanings, and that we think we have to explore more. All these issues are not new at all, but we suggest that seeing these issues from Chinese New Town or using Chinese New Town as a lens can open a new understanding of them and help to move our view of the urban itself. The first issue is urbanization as a transcolor process. We have considered Chinese urbanization as part of the so-called planetary urbanization of the global urban model made of relationships and flows, exchanges and intersections. Inserted in this model, Chinese New Town show a sort of dissociation between the city and the urban. They present various urban forms in which not everything is a city, but everything seems to be driven by the urban. At the same time, Chinese New Town show limits, contradiction, and possibilities of today's global urban economic development. The second issue is urban fragment. At first sight, we can describe Chinese new towns by listing urban materials and objects as a set of railway stations, central business district, residential compounds, and so on. However, all these building spaces appear impossible to connect each other, to consider part of a single urban entity. Of course, this could be considered as a problem, but at the same time, the fragmented feature of Chinese New Town allow us to reflect on the nature of city as a single entity based on a fixed and stable identity. Chinese new towns seem to show the radical multiplicity of urban spaces and the many words that have always made up the urban. The third issue is the role of infrastructure. As all we know, airport, railway station, railway lines, motorways, highways dominate the transformation of the Chinese landscape. Although what we see is amazing, it's only a part of the urban infrastructure. Indeed, miles of pipes, cables, are hidden underground, telecommunication and satellite networks fill the air. Urbanization is not only physically built by infrastructure, but is made possible by infrastructure, by the distribution of water and electricity, by the organization of logistics, communication and transport. However, infrastructure is not just a background or a silent stage. As clearly appears in Chinese new towns, and in particular in the transitional space in life between urban and rural, infrastructure is also, and perhaps above all, a political, economic and social structures that define and support, or not, every aspect of the urban life. Finally, the last issue is the need to rethink the relationship between urban and rural, and more radically to rethink urban and rural in themselves. As all we know, the relationship between urban and rural is traditionally seen as an opposition, framed in a dichotomic view, dividing city and countryside, city and nature, city and the outside, as called by Neil Brenner, claiming for an urban theory without an outside. This vision is often affected by nostalgia, anachronism, and universalism, and at the same time clashes with what we see, not only in Chinese New Town, but almost everywhere. Of course, urban and rural in China have an institutional and a political role in terms of citizen rights and land regime. However, when we observe Chinese new towns, it's very hard to discover where does the city end and the countryside begin. Seeing from Chinese new towns seems to us that to understand the city, we must question the countryside. To understand the urban, we must question the rural. It's not a matter of hybridity between the city and the countryside, but need to avoid any predefined categories and to radically redefine or better still, redescribe both the urban and the rural, that seem to us combined and superimposed, creating a complex set of intersection, relationships, exchanges, and flows in which distinction dissolve and predefined order disappear. I stop here with my introduction. These are our ideas, our doubts, our attempts. These are what we would like to discuss with you. Thank you a lot again to be with us. I give the floor, or better the screen and the mic, to Jian to welcome our guest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for the introduction. So as one of the curators of the exhibition, it's my pleasure to see the taking place of this seminar and of course the opening of the exhibition. So it's my pleasure to chair the first session of this seminar, which is titled as Urban China and Urban Theories. So in this session, we will have our 4 speakers from both Europe, the United States, and also from China. So each of them will have about 20 minutes for their presentation. And then at the end of the 4 presentations, we will have about half hour for discussions on the questions among the speakers, but also with the questions from the audience. So first of all, I would like to introduce the first speaker of the first session, Professor Amin, a professor of geography at the University of Cambridge. Professor Amin is well known for his work in urban culture and economic geography. He writes a lot on urban and regional development, contemporary cultural change, progressive politics, and the collaborative economy. His recent work is on ecology of mental health in Shanghai and Delhi, on grammars of the urban, and on post-identity politics. Even though I don't have the precise title of his presentation, but it seems that he's going to talk about his work on mental health and migrations in Shanghai. So Professor Amin, the macro is in your hands, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your introduction and also the invitation to this seminar. I'm sorry I didn't give you a title. The title of my talk is Vernacular Urbanism. And what I want to do is this, based on my work in Shanghai on how dwelling practices mediate mental health, I want to explore what vernacular urbanism implies for our theorization of 2 things. 1, mental health in the city, and secondly, the grammar of urban theory in general. For the most part of my 20 minutes, I want to talk about our results on migrants, rural to urban migrants in Shanghai, drawing on work with a brilliant young anthropologist called Lisa Richaud on how poor migrants deal with something called urban stress, which our interlocutors often describe as, in Chinese, a word called yali, which is broadly stress. And then I want to offer some very quick theoretical reflections at the end. So at the end of 2019, we completed a 3-year project which was led by King's College in London by Nick Rose on the metropolis and mental health. And Lisa and I focused on ethnographies of everyday living over an 18-month period. I mean, Lisa did most of the ethnographic work, all of it, in fact, in 2 locations in Shanghai, which you see on the map One is Juting, a peri-urban district suffering in southwest Shanghai, suffering from very rapid factory closures. And there we focused on one residential and shopping street, the main shopping street called Tongli Road. And then secondly, we focused on the Fuzhou Road, which is in the central business district of the city, where young migrants find low paid and precarious work in the service sector. Our aim was to record and explain mild and severe mental disorders, and pretty much in response to one, a growing policy concern with mental health in the city, but also a mainstream argument in the urban literature that urban living is bad for mental health, especially the mental health of migrants and the poorest people living in cities, who are said to experience the trauma of rural dislocation, the shock of the urban modern, and the stresses of very harsh, very difficult working and living conditions in the city. And the argument here is that this kind of environment leads to anxiety, depression, and more severe mental disorders such as schizophrenia. And here, urbanicity is seen to be as morbid. And we felt that this view assumed a kind of a shock response pathology based on the premise that subjectivity in the city is preformed, prefixed. And in this case, the subjectivity of the vulnerable body encounters what we would call a fixed urbanicity, that is the overwhelming city. We felt that this kind of approach of, if you like, a shock and response approach to urban mental health neglected mental states which are formed in the living of the city habitat. Now, in the field, we found plenty of evidence of migrants facing unrelenting yali, unrelenting pressure, which arises from hardship, from precarity, from uncertainty, and very restricted urban rights, especially the absence of housing rights. But what was very interesting is that we found very little evidence of severe mental disorders. We found some evidence of mild mental disorders, but not severe mental disorders. I mean, maybe the people with such disorders had returned back to the countryside. That's possible. Maybe they were invisible to us. That's also possible. But nonetheless, the facts on the ground are that we did not find evidence of severe mental disorder. Nor did we find a lot of evidence of people, of the migrants in the two study sites, resorting to the explosion of psychiatric therapies that have proliferated in China in the last decade, ranging from access to online counseling, street-level consultations, or the use of traditional and Western medicines, and also, of course, official clinics and hospitals. And the migrant population really did not feature within what has been called a new Chinese Psy regime. Most importantly, we found that in the negotiation of yali, of stress, that the everyday rituals of living the moment and of placemaking played a really critical role. At best, living the moment helped individuals to domesticate, to slow down stress. And in the worst cases, living the moment accentuated their dislocation and also their alienation from urban society. What we found is that within the rituals of living the moment or of living space arose mental dispositions which were formed in the reciprocities of body and habitat. And this forced our attention, and it should force attention in urban thinking as a whole, on the power, the significance of micro ecologies of dwelling as spaces of therapeutic care, or the opposite. And this is very far from any notion of the generic urban acting as a stressor to vulnerable subjects in the city. So to save on time, let me provide just a couple of illustrations from the site on Fuzhou Road, which is one of the last low-rise blocks in the city's CBD, where young migrants work in cafes, restaurants, and a range of specialist shops, for instance, cosmetic boutiques, hair care product places, shops were selling or producing textiles. And these young migrants face very long hours, long commuting times, very low pay. They're fired and hired very easily. But they see themselves, interestingly, in contrast to Tongli Road, they see themselves very much as new urban cosmopolitans. They don't want to go back to the countryside. They want to stay in the city. And the examples that I will show in a minute about the negotiation of mental states through practices of dwelling are very much about the slowing down of time and space, about momentary respite and hope that arises from exercising a certain kind of right of access and dwelling in public space. So here is the first site, which I see is not appearing on the PowerPoint. Okay, we have it here now. In the quiet and immaculately furnished Huangyu District Library, on the 7th floor reading room, men with time on their hands or those facing considerable existential difficulties quietly linger, quietly loiter, undisturbed for hours on end. Here is a typical ethnographic moment recorded by Lisa about living out the private in public as a form of recuperated comfort. You see here that somebody is sitting with all their belongings in the computer space. There's somebody else also reading newspapers. About half an hour later, the man grabs his flask and returns to his desk. This entire example, what it tells us is that you see these so-called distressed people just using the public space, in this case the library, as a way of conducting their private affairs, going to the toilet, laughing with each other, pretending to have a joke, etc. So how do you interpret this, what's going on here? We describe this space as an ecology of self-abeyance. If you like, a kind of temporary suspension of the stresses of urban life. People resting in a public space without any threat of stigma or surveillance, and with all the possibilities of being alone together, feeling part of the modern city, of feeling that they have a right of access to public space, in this case with beautiful rosewood furniture and in a silent atmosphere. What you find here is a kind of atmospheric attunement, as Kathleen Stewart would put it, in a convivial space. So let me keep going and run to the second example. Coming to the second example, here we find another ritual of domestication of space, whose indwelling yields temporary moments of hope. In this case, through the time young people can spend amongst self-help books in one of several public bookshops in the Fuzhou Road area. These are bookshops which are really quite well furbished, beautiful bookshops, which are surrounded by, within the bookshops, by cafeterias, books, a silent and again very permissive staff, and others, of course, actually buying books or taking in the quiet surroundings. Here is another typical example of what's going on in this public space. A typical ethnographic moment is Fei Fei is consulting self-help books in the hope of an improvement to his circumstances as a way of dealing with urban disappointment and depression in his case. And Lisa and I, you can see again in this situation, Fei Fei is sitting amongst different books. Fei Fei is the only one in our survey who admitted who's suffering from dread, thinking too much, and depression. And what Fei Fei is doing here is he's immersed in a book written by Jack Ma, the creator of Alibaba, about what makes you successful. And Fei Fei wants to know what makes the strong at heart, so that he too can become the strong at heart in the future. Of course, in this case, and unfortunately, Fei Fei had to leave the city because his difficulties continued. So what Lisa and I described in our work, this microspace, we called it an ecology of transitional hope, where urban Yali is confronted by the promise of self-help in a place, again, made homely, not policed. Nobody is stopped. Nobody is told to stop lingering here for a long time. You can stay here. And here in this, again, public bookshop, you see the rehearsing of transition to a better life, which is momentarily helped by the atmospheric relations that you see in this image, this intermingling of body, bookshelves, books, quietude, complete silence, and a certain kind of freedom to be in that space. But as I said before, in this case, this was as Laurent Bernhard would put it, a moment of cruel optimism. The seduction of self-help was only a seduction of self-help. It didn't actually lead to any betterment of Fei Fei's life. The Fei Fei felt he had failed, and he was going to return home. His depression getting the better of him. So let me now just come to a conclusion, and let me close on two theoretical reflections. First, what emerges from this kind of attentiveness to the microgeographies of urban dwelling is that any theorization of the city as a place of mental disorder has to give way to something much more granular, something much more fine-grained. To to seeing the city as a lived milieu where mental states arise in the intersections of corporeal practices and the qualities of the material and symbolic environment. Put it differently, we have to see subjectivity arising in the encounter between body and habitat. Here, the practices of rendering space habitable and sometimes also hospitable enter into the equation of enduring urban stress. We're invited to look at the city as a series of, in the way that Virginia Woolf put it, a series of moments of being that cumulatively, but also in their specificity, shape urban mental health. Secondly, I think my example is of many showing the city as a relation, as a negotiation. A plurality of everyday happenings, as Francesca said in her introduction, in which, very interestingly, structure, immanence, materiality, institution, and subjectivity all fold together to produce the urban rhythm. And this urban rhythm is always specific, it is always changing, it is always evolving. It pretty much in the way that we have been reminded in the last 10 years by post-colonial writing and assemblage urbanism. The city viewed from below escapes abstract categorization, and it escapes categorical generalization. Instead, we have to recognize that it is the 1,001 lines of flight that we must attend to in understanding the city, the granularity of the city, these granular ways in which habitat and human endeavor live within each other. So I hope I have shown this, at least in relation to the making of urban subjectivity.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Amin. Thank you very much for this very interesting debates from the perspective of vernacular urbanism, which you call it, which actually talks about the mental health of the migrants, taking Shanghai as an example. I think that's a very important issue. Taking into consideration that each year in China, there are about 14 million people migrating from the rural areas to urban areas, and how they can be used to the new life in the city, and how they can be provided with a new way of life, with new public services, is a big challenge, not only for the migrants, but also for local authorities. And I think it's very interesting to think about the mental health issue, especially today when China is trying to make healthy cities for people, not only for people already living in cities, but also for people who are planning to move in cities. So I think we will continue the discussion at the end of this session for further ideas. So thank you very much. Now I would like to invite our second speaker of the first session, Professor Lu Andong. Professor Lu Andong is a professor in architecture, and he's also head of Department of Architecture of Nanjing University in China. He's a board member of the Committee of Urban Design of the Architectural Society of China and UIA Committee of Public Space. He has published widely in academic journals. He is also the architect of the China Pavilion at the 2018 London Design Biennale and the master planner of the Nanjing UNESCO City of Literature. The title of his presentation is from a mutated place to augmented place, a brief cultural history of China's urban regeneration. So, Professor Liu, now the microphone is in your hand.
Thank you, Professor Liu. I have a PowerPoint, so perhaps we can switch to my PowerPoint. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Professor Liu,
Yes.
is it fine?
Yeah, please. It's perfect.
Good. Thanks to Michele for inviting me to join this inspiring seminar. I try to respond to the topic that China goes urban. And I have been quite curious about the recent change or paradigm shift in this approach of going urban. Actually, I think there are a lot of misunderstanding about the urbanization in China, which has actually went through several stages of change. So especially in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, and then this year after the COVID-19 situation, I think new issues are emerging. So I try to make a theoretical reflection on the ongoing transformation and try to provide some of my readings on the situation. Actually, I have changed my title a little bit from what I've proposed, and I find it quite not that hard to talk about the cultural history, but actually I start from the current situation and try to work back. But so I find it too long if I talk about the cultural history. So I'm probably more focused on the current stage. Oh yes. So I will talk about some of the very recent projects in the current urban regeneration wave in China. This is the newest issue of the architectural journal, the Jian Xuebao, published in October this year. The special issue focused on the community making and urban micro regeneration and includes several quite interesting projects, which is, I think, represents what is going on at the moment. So this is a project by a professor in Southeast University in Nanjing, Tongming. This project was based in Shanghai. We can see here a kind of quite normal urban situation in China, in which residence areas were actually circulated by walls. And in the quite recent movement to remove or get rid of those small shops and vendors, and those blank walls and some of the kind of empty spaces become a problem in the city. And very recently, I think from probably last year, there was urban efforts to try to provide a remedy for the situation and to make this micro regeneration in order to make this kind of negative space more positive or make it to improve the situation. So here is the quite extraordinary project that Tongming, Professor Tong, tried to use the very narrow strip of this walls along the neighborhood and use a reference of the traditional Chinese garden and transform this narrow wall space into a strip of urban public area. I'm not sure whether we can see the image clearly, but I will try to explain with words. So here's a very narrow strip of residue land just along this wall of the neighborhood. So the design was to make use of this narrow strip of land. So what you see here is a very narrow architectural intervention into this kind of urban situation, and borrowing the idea of the Chinese garden and using transparency, a quite modern language, but then in the same time try to resort to the traditional aesthetics. And actually, this kind of urban space was not totally a contemporary invention. I think in my childhood, I think in the 80s and the 1990s, there was such kind of urban space in the Chinese cities, in which I think a lot of people use of these galleries and the pavilions and as public areas. So this is a kind of area photo of this transformation of a kind of blank wall into a kind of walled gardens. A second case was designed by Professor Zhuang Shen, also a pocket park or pocket square in Shanghai. So this was the original situation. It is a leftover space, just surrounded on three sides and with only one side open to the city. So here is a kind of aerial view and also model showing this kind of infill of this city tissue. So also I think the architect's design tried to make use of this form and try to provide a corridor that to redefine the space into a kind of courtyard that resorts to the traditional kind of traditional language. So what we see here is a quite delicate tectonic that makes the corridor, and then people actually use it. And for example, as an informal market in the daytime, and also as a kind of gathering space in the evening. Here's another case from Beijing by Mr. Wang Hui, an architect from Urbanus. He tried to design or regenerate, I think, several courtyards in a Hutong area. So here are the original situation, quite dilapidated. So I think the overall plan is quite interesting. I think several architects were invited to each take charge of selected courtyards. And Mr. Wang Hui selected 3 adjacent different courtyards and tried to design these courtyards as a one campaign. So on the left is the original survey drawing, and on the right is the architectural proposal that actually tried to use this leftover space and regenerate as a kind of integrated area. And the proposal actually kept all the original residents and also their kind of lifestyle. So try to provide small semi-private space for the individual resident, so they can make use of it for their private use, but it can also be shared by others, by the neighbors. So what we see here are the completed effect. And some leftover space become now a kind of a positive shared little public communal space. And similarly, this is in southern China, I think Shenzhen, designed by one of my friends, Mr. Zhang Yuxing, Professor Zhang Yuxing in Shenzhen. And this is actually a regeneration of a kind of urban village situation. So what we see here is actually the result. This project is part of the Shenzhen Biennale. So the architect and designer try to relish the opportunity of the Biennale and use the funding to regenerate the kind of central part of the village and bring it a new life. So here are the areas outlined by the yellow line. Is the area that the architect actually intervened. So it focused on internal canal, I think, and tried to improve the situation of the canal that then tried to stimulate the kind of communal life of the whole village. And basically the project starts from the improving the water condition and then adding small facilities along the canal. So also adding small communal space. And also we can see here some of the leftover spaces were kept original, and then elevated walkway were added that connects the originally separated alleys and lanes. And then events and also markets were introduced, and to actually stimulate and invite the local residents to participate in the regeneration project. And here is yet another case also from Nanjing by Professor Han Dongqing. This is called the Little West Lake regeneration in the old city of Nanjing. What we see here is quite, it's a historic urban area, but it's already very fragmented. So the project tried to actually give it a new order by also finding, what we can see here is a small piecemeal by piecemeal improvement that try to re-establish a new system in this quite fragmented area. And what we hear is this original situation, and that's after the regeneration. Some of the effects. And yet another case by a star architect, Mr. Liu Jiakun, in Zhejiang province, in Songyang, is also in a quite dense kind of urban neighborhood situation. And the architect tried to find a way that to kind of actually move or find the little leftover space and fabricate a new system and make it public or provide a more lively shared space into the community. Some of the drawings. And that's before and after. Before and after. So that's the kind of new communal life in this development. Quite interestingly, this project also resorts to the traditional garden aesthetics. So what's interesting is that obviously this new wave of urban regeneration is quite different from what's happening in the previous stage, in which the old areas were removed, people were moved to other places, and the original neighborhood were replaced, or at least replaced by new cultural interventions. But in this new wave, I think primarily the local community were protected, and the focus is to how to stimulate the vitality and also the public participation in this kind of neighborhood. But my question is that a story as simple as that? So especially after the COVID-19 situation, I start to think about what, in a sense, is a contemporary conception of place. Obviously, we cannot separate the local life from the global flow, global situation. So anywhere there is a COVID or there is a problem, it will transmit it to another place in just by hours. So there is no obvious separation between local and global. In the same time, I also start to wonder whether there is a kind of independent human world as such, or on the contrary, we cannot separate human world with the biological environment. So the man and the biological environment is actually one continuum. And also, I think with the improvement of technology, especially the kind of mobile internet and the Internet of Things, so this new technology actually demonstrated its power to invade into everyday life and into the kind of observation and even surveillance and kind of facilitate the individual's interaction with the world. So what I see here is a contemporary situation or a contemporary conception of place that was mutated by three new dimensions, a global spatial dimension, and a kind of a biological dimension, as well as a technology dimension, which works on all these three dimensions, have its effect on the human-place interaction. So I think today we can no longer separate the genius loci, or a kind of sense of place, from this larger picture. So I will use two cases to demonstrate or to elaborate my argument. Can I? Yes. So this is also a project designed by Professor Zhuangshen, and it's actually a factory in the outskirts of the city, so in the middle of nowhere. But it becomes a tourist attraction. So on the right, we can see a kind of a website interface that's showing it ranks first as a tourist attraction in the city. So this building is actually located somewhere in this kind of suburb situation. So in one of these factories. So there's no way to discover or to distinguish it from its neighboring buildings. So this project is actually a regeneration of an kind of internal space of a deserted factory. But it becomes a tourist attraction due to the internet. So it becomes a kind of a very popular site for visits for the younger generation. So people visit there in order to take those photos like this. So I think this is a new situation in which the facade or elevation or outer appearance of a project is no longer relevant. I mean, its internal appearance becomes its new interface on the internet. So the internet becomes the public space, while the offline, the actual space, become a demonstration of its online body. So from there, I start to wonder whether the internet or the new technology has invented new kind of places that does not exist in our previous architectural imagination. So I try to make a periodical table of all the possible new kind of newly created places. I actually have 66, so I quickly go through. I have no time to explain all of that. So the most virtual one is the imagined realm and cyberspace, the make-believe space, random space, responsive space, in which space can give a response to the people in real time. This telecontrol space, which is totally possible today. Space-time continuum, which is actually most architects work on. A reversal space. The improvisation space. The clue space. The nomadic space. The recursion space. Duration space. Occasional space, which is a space that only appears in certain period of time. It's a filtration space. Augmented space. Synapsis space. So it's the So it's incarnation space. Sorry, I moved too fast. The incarnation space, the fit space, retrieval space, then the barrage space, the endorsement space, proliferation, stacking, compressible.
I'm sorry, Professor Lu. I'm sorry for disturbing you, but you
used too much of my
probably,
time?
2 minutes to finish.
I switched just to the end of my presentation. Is it possible? I don't know how to jump to the last page.
And you may probably go to the end of your presentation for any conclusions or remarks.
Yeah, I know, but I can only just click one page to one page. Can anyone help me to go to the end? So I think what's interesting for me is that the contemporary situation is that we are facing a new situation of place in which the technology, the space of flow, and also a biological dimensions, they are intertwined, and all in the center of this new kind of junction is a human situated in between. So I start to have a kind of a hypothesis in which we are actually standing in front of a third phase of the kind of humanity, architectural humanity, I think, in which the augmented man becomes the core of place. So the technology allows us to intervene into the humankind as individual, to access its subjectivity and to give response to his need and desire in a new accuracy that cannot be obtained in any kind of previous design methods. So, that's my understanding of the transformation of place in the current situation. So my argument is that so the current stage of urban regeneration in China, in which there was a move from the kind of urban sprawl or the dismantle towards a more community-based regeneration. But then I think there's another quite important possibility to be envisaged by architecture. That is how technology, not only technology affect how we make and produce buildings, but rather how technology facilitates the human interaction with place. And that will be the origin of a new architecture and new urbanism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Lu. It's quite interesting that after Professor Amin gave us his understanding of urbanism from a sociological perspective regarding the mental health, you discussed the urbanism issue again from architectural perspective. And also, I thought it's very interesting, both of you mentioned the transition period. And this transition period actually influenced the understanding of people on urban life, but also influenced our understanding on architecture. So again, I think we can continue our discussion at the end of this session. So at the same time, I got a message from our technical group that we have already about 350 participants in the online meeting. So for all the participants online, you have the access to put forward any of your questions regarding the presentation of our speakers through the chat function. So you may leave your questions in the chat box, and then the organizer will help us to list your questions, and we can have a discussion at the end of the session. Okay, so thank you very much again to Professor Liu. Now we move on to our third presentation of this session. So our third speaker is Brent. Professor Brent is Associate Professor of Urban Design and Public Policy and Head of the City Design and Development Group in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. His research focuses on the aesthetics and politics of contemporary urban design, particularly with respect to current and pressing issues like deindustrialization and climate change. He has several publications, and the latest one is about the largest art. I think that might be also the topic of his presentation, the largest art, the plural qualities of urban design. Brent, the floor is yours. Sorry, Brent, it seems that you are muted. We cannot hear you.
Now?
Yeah, now it works.
Now
Yes,
it works,
please.
okay. This is new software, so there's always some excitement with making sure the technical aspects work. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. I'm coming to all of you from the small European nation of Portugal, where I'm living during the COVID epidemic. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be speaking in concert with such interesting colleagues. I really appreciated listening to my two colleagues as well, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll have following. So I'll move to my presentation, if I may. I'm going to be speaking from my book, The Largest Art, a measured manifesto for a plural urbanism. And this book came out in 2017, and it encapsulates a lot of my thinking about urban design. And I think a lot of conditions and considerations that are relevant to the Chinese city, and in particular to the challenge of designing new cities in China, which I know is a widespread phenomenon. So let me start by saying that urban design is a discipline, I think is a discipline that needs utopias. Design is predicated on a vision of a better world, and designers thrive when they have visions of that better world by which to guide their design efforts, even if those visions of the better world never fully come to pass. And urban design, perhaps, of all of the arts, is an art that has been characterized by the proliferation and proposition of utopias. Let me review three of them briefly. One of those is a notion of giant architecture, that the world might be designed as a single large machine, perhaps a megastructure, or that the city might be encapsulated within a single large building. This is the utopian vision of bigness proposed by Rem Koolhaas. Another vision is of a vision where we live in perfect harmony with the past. This is the neo-traditional vision, where history is reborn and cities exist in perfect dialogue with the past. There's no disruption, there's no cruel modernity, there's no destruction of the past, but we live in harmony with it. And a third utopia is what I would call the ecological paradise vision, that we can somehow come into perfect harmony with nature, either by moving out into the countryside and living in a cottage in a garden, which was the vision of the 19th century, or the 21st century's vision of landscape urbanism, where somehow the whole earth becomes a single landscape that's simultaneously inhabitable by human beings and simultaneously sustainable. I actually don't think that any of these utopias are possible. So when I began taking the opportunity to think about urban design in a utopian sensibility about 10 years ago, I thought of a different potential for utopia in urban design. I wanted to think about the utopia of pluralism. I think this is a pragmatic utopia, and maybe one that's more realizable than the previous utopias that I've spoken about. A pluralist world is a world where there would be no single truth. And in a world where there would be no single truth, there could be no single vision of urban design. In fact, a pluralist world would be a world where there is no single ideal of urban design that's equivalent to the previous versions that we saw on the past pages. This would be an urban design that is consistent with the world that we live in, a world that's characterized by diversity, by difference, by debate, or at least hopefully is characterized by these features. And I think we've seen some evidence of this in the previous two presentations as well, with calls for agglomerations, etc. My question that I asked myself was, how can this utopia of pluralism that I think is going to be the utopia that we might realize, how can this utopian pluralism coexist with urban design? And the question that we might consider for ourselves today is, can plural design actually shape the design of new towns in the Chinese city? So let me go through a couple of the qualities of pluralist urban design that I review in my book. Let's first remember that urban design is not predicated and does not have its origins in pluralism. Urban design instead has its origins in the concept of the total state, a state where all is controlled by a single absolute ruler. And maybe one of the first of these, at least in the European context, was Louis XIV, who designed Versailles around 1680. If you take a careful look at this image, you see that it's really an image of harmony. Harmony was actually achieved under total control a long time ago. We have architecture, the palace, the garden, and the city, all designed by a single hand, all existing in harmony, but it's the harmony of top-down rule. Here we have another example of urban design's top-down origins in the St. Petersburg of Peter the Great. This was a capital that was declared to exist by the Tsar, by fiat, in order to move Russia more toward the West, and it was one of the world's first designed cities, at least in the European West. So let's now explore some of the plural qualities of urban design. And I think the interesting thing about this that I explained in my book is that these plural qualities all to some extent already exist, but they exist in the city. These are qualities of pluralism that exist in the city, but urban design over time has fought against these plural qualities because of what I call of an intellectual inheritance from top-down design in architecture and the strong state that I explained in the past episodes. So let me explain these 5 plural qualities of urban design, and I'll show some examples of these very quickly. The qualities are the following: scale, time, property, agency, and form. Here we see that urban design can have a multiplicity of different scales, and I'll simply provide a few examples. Very interesting urban design can be found in the Seagram building by Mies van der Rohe. It's an urban design that consists of only four components: the Seagram building itself, the plaza in front of the Seagram building, the street of Park Avenue that's scarcely visible in this image, and the racket club across the street. These elements of the built environment are all aligned and designed in concert with each other, and I would argue that the Seagram building is a small-scale work of urban design. What I want to argue is that urban design is actually plural in its scales. There's no single scale for urban design, and urban design accomplishes the widest scale range of all of the building arts. Here's a much larger scale example of urban design, the famous Barcelona Ensanche or Eixample, proposed and then implemented over the 100 years after Cerdà's proposal of 1859. It's an example of urban design at the city district scale. And perhaps the largest scale of urban design that's possible, although I'm always waiting for others to counter-argue this example, is the London Greenbelt, which was implemented in 1947. Again, this required a parliamentary act, the Town and Country Planning Act. Urban design becomes more and more difficult to achieve as it increases in scale. But look at the range of scales possible, from that of 3 or 4 elements in the city to shaping the scale of an entire region. Urban design is also plural in its dimension of time. It's a very interesting quality of urban design that's harder to achieve in other arts. Urban design eventually becomes an artifact of the era in which it's constructed in some instances when urban design is small enough in scale. For example, the Place des Vosges is essentially an intact artifact of the early 17th century, and it is a work of urban design. But many other works of urban design display many, many different aspects of time. Look at this example, for example. The Sana designed new museum on the Bowery in New York City. The Sana-designed new museum, at least formally in its architectural character, has very little to do with its nearby surroundings. And yet, the new museum combines 3 smaller building parcels, itself reflecting the scale of the city district in which it's a part. So the dimension of time here is reflected in the persistence of lot lines, not in the building design itself. Architects acting as urban designers, to be honest, have always tried to design urban design complexes to resist time, and Chandigarh's Capital Complex is a great example. This complex was designed to be eternal, and yet the city of Chandigarh, as well as the buildings of the Capital Complex itself, have continued to evolve, defeating Corbusier's attempt to create a static architectural complex. And I'll return to this concept of static architecture in urban design at the end of my presentation. I want to speak now about a third plural dimension, which is the dimension of property, very important consideration when it comes to cities. And as an example of the pluralism of property, I want to look at the United States city. The United States is a country that celebrates the proliferation of private properties, and this is registered in the form of American cities. This 19th century city of Lawrence, Kansas is a good example. We see here a city that's designed purely on the basis of plural properties. It's a speculative grid where every landowner ideally has the same amount of access, the same property rights, and the same equality. This doesn't make American cities particularly beautiful, but it does respect the multiplicity or pluralism of private property in these cities. A strong counterexample, and one where you might say the urban design is actually more accomplished, can be seen in the 1937 Master Plan of Moscow. This master plan, together with all Soviet urbanism and architecture, reflected the lack of private property in these cities. Of course, it was a socialist economy. This lack of private property, in fact, made the Soviet Union a utopia for urban design, with some of the most strongly and powerfully designed cities of the world. So it's interesting that the pluralism of property and the strength of urban design sometimes seem to be acting against each other. But let's think about the people who live in and work in cities. These are what I call agents, and the plural agents are the fourth dimension of pluralism that I want to speak about. Remember, different actors collectively construct cities. Different actors collectively live in cities, and each of us is psychologically and morally an independent individual. Cities are unique collections of thousands and millions of different individuals. And when we see architectural artifacts like the Manzana de Discordia in Barcelona, it's a quirky reminder that different actors, these were different bourgeoisie who had different tastes in their housing, collectively construct cities, and that the different taste of these plural actors can create some type of architectural and urban disharmony. Rem Koolhaas, in fact, became fascinated by this pluralism of agency when he looked at Lagos, Nigeria, famous and yet still unpublished study from the early 2000s. Koolhaas saw in Lagos a form of chaos, where there was an infinity of plural agents but seemingly no urban design. Koolhaas was fascinated by the fact that with no urban design at all, the city managed to function. And it made him raise an existential question that with an infinity of plural agents, how can urban design really exist? And this is a question that I also ask myself and try to solve in my book, The Largest Art. Other architects have also struggled with integrating the pluralism of agents with the design of the architect. Maybe one of the earlier ones was John Houbraken, who constructed housing that permitted inhabitants an ability to shape their environment. But of course, Alejandro Aravena, who was recently awarded the Pritzker Prize, has famously recreated this acknowledgement of the plural dimension of agents in his housing in Iquique, Chile in the early 2000s. Lastly, I'll speak about form. Art typically takes a single form, as does architecture, but urban design can take multiple forms. And I'd like to contrast two cities as exemplars of how urban design can exist as a single form or as multiple forms. Let's look at Paris, which is arguably a single work of urban design composed of thousands of constituent parts. And when we look at the Rue de Rivoli, and I believe we would see the same feature in Turin, Italy, we'd see a consistency of organization and alignment that seemed to make the city a single work of art. Yet when we go to London, we see a very different approach to urban design, but one that itself is not displeasing. London, everyone would acknowledge, lacks the overall order of Paris. It has fragmented urbanism, but the green squares and row houses are also quite pleasing. In conclusion, I want to talk about three principles that I think are important for urban design, and the first is called eternal change. Designing a city is equivalent to what architect David Crane called painting on a river. And I think urban design bears an uncomfortable relationship with the change that's always present in cities. 19th century artists also tried to confront this when they painted waterfalls. How do you confront a dynamic entity through a static medium? That's one of the challenges of urban design. So I think that change is eternal in urban design, and that we need to project new ways of urban design that acknowledge change and that permit it without making urban design concepts break or fall apart. So urban designers can develop modes that accommodate and reflect change. Next, I'd like to think about incompletion. Incompletion is probably the major challenge affecting urban designers. Incomplete buildings, frankly, are an embarrassment. Peter Eisenman's City of Culture in Galicia is incomplete. It's incomplete because it was too large and the government ran out of financing and it couldn't be completed. So incompletion in buildings is an embarrassment, and yet incompletion in urban design is inevitable. Cities can never be complete. And urban design, in fact, because it is part of the city, can never be complete as well. So I want to propose that urban design need not depend upon completion, but that urban design, like this abstract scheme here, can succeed even if incomplete. Lastly, I'm going to speak about flexible fidelity, how urban design can be vague and yet still be successful. Advocates of bigness, like the firm Big, quite popular in these recent years, create closely designed massive buildings. They're attempting to realize the urban design and creation of a city, but at high fidelity, where every detail is designed by the architect. Cities, in fact, are not places that can be closely designed just like a building. I propose that cities can be characterized by areas of greater or lesser fidelity of urban design. And I would propose that new towns are, in fact, urban design environments that are proposed to be designed like a single work of architecture. But I think in pluralist urban design, we can merit a relaxation of control over some parts of the city. So in conclusion, I wanted to think about urban design's plural futures. First of all, I don't think pure pluralism will ever be completely possible in urban design. Urban design does require some exercise of control over plural elements of the city. But I think an urban design can occur that respects and accommodates pluralism more than urban design ideals are doing at the current time. Maybe a more existential question: are new towns in fact consistent with pluralism? In a certain sense, no, but new towns could have many plural elements, and I'll show that in my final slide. What would a plural new town look like? Here are a couple of qualities that might characterize plural new towns. Maybe a new town could have multiple different designers. It could be designed to evolve over time. It could have consistency mixed with variation, like we saw with the concept of flexible fidelity. And my final slide, I want to show a pluralist new town that was designed by architect David Crane at the University of Pennsylvania in 1961 for the country of India, a country that at the time was building Chandigarh, designed in part by Le Corbusier. Crane wanted to portray a kind of anti-Chandigarh, so he created design spaces in conjunction with undesigned spaces, built space in conjunction with empty space, closely designed space in concert with loosely designed space, space that was partially designed as a skeletal framework so that its inhabitants could fill it in later. Here he was foreseeing Aravena's work 40 years before the moment. This pluralist new town was never designed, but pluralist new towns could exist in the future, and they would be respecting the principles of plural urbanism that I've discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brent. And now we move from vernacular urbanism to architectural urbanism and then to plural urbanism. It's quite interesting to listen to your argument that urban design actually can create a plural quality through different scale, time, property, agency, and the forms. And also, again, through the last image of your presentation, again, we think about the term of transition, which seems the keywords of the previous three presentations. It's quite interesting to think about whether a city can be fixed or a city can be designed in a flexible way, which can evolve and change along the path of the time. So again, I think this might be a point that we can discuss at the end of the session. Thank you very much. Now I have a good news because I have the information that at this moment we have already over 800 participants to our seminar. So for our online participants, please put forward your questions through chat. We will discuss them at the end of this session. Now let's move to the last speaker of the first session. So it's Professor Bian Lanchun from School of Architecture, Tsinghua University. So Professor Bian is a professor of urban planning and design. He's also the deputy director of Urban Design Academy Academic Committee of China Urban Planning Society. He has been engaged in teaching, research, and practice of urban planning and design for a long time, with a particular focus on Beijing. So he participated in the City Master Plan of Beijing, presided the urban design research of Beijing's capital core area and the conservation of Shichahai, a historical and cultural area in the old city of Beijing. And also recently, he won the International Urban Design Competition of Tongzhou suburban subcenter of Beijing. So probably more as a practitioner of urban design, Professor Bian will talk about the characteristics of urbanization in China. So Professor Bian, the microphone is yours. Professor Bian, I think you are still mute. Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Liu. Yeah. And also thank you for the invitation me to share my understanding of China's urbanization. Yeah, now I will show my slides. Is that okay? Okay. I'm very glad to show my understanding about China's urbanization. The title is Characteristics of Urbanization in China. Yeah, there are 4 parts of my presentation. The first is brief introduce. Yeah, I think the world is going in the era of cities. According to the latest report of the United Nations, in 2018, the global population was 7.6 billion, and the urban population was 4.2 billion. By 2050, the global population will reach 9.7 billion. About 6-8% of the population will live in the city areas. In the future, 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities. But there is an imbalance in the process of the global urbanization. In the past 20 years, China's new urban areas accounted for 47.5% of the world's total new urban areas, ranking first in the world, and ranking second in the United States with the total newly added urban area accounting for 9% of the world. China has made remarkable achievements in urbanization, which is in sharp contrast to the urbanization of higher income countries represented by the Europe and the United States, and the low income countries in Africa, South Asia, and other regions. So the cause of China's reform and opening up is an evolutionary history of urbanization. In 1949, China's urbanization rate only 10.5%. In 1978, China's urbanization rate was less than 20%. In 2020, China's urbanization rate will exceed 60%. So in the past 40 years of reform and opening up, China's population has increased from 963 million to about 1.4 billion. And the level of urbanization has increased by 40%. So in the history process, a large number of farmers left their previous means of product land, entered to the city, and put themselves as the factor of production into the history process of repeat urban development. Great changes have taken place in China urban and rural environment. So the first ever brief introduction about the background of the basic conditions of China's urbanization development. The first, I think, is the population. Oh, you know, the China's population ranks first in the world. China's mainland has a population of about 1 billion and 340 million, according to the census in China. The second is the human environment. There are great differences in geographical conditions in China. We can see from the maps that the southeast coast areas is densely populated, but on the other hand, the living environment in northwest China is poor and bad. The third is the policy influence. The difference between urban and rural areas in China has the particularity of policy influence. The first is the registered residence policy. China's city and rural management of the registered residence system has direct impact on the population mobility. The second is the land policy. China's land is divided into state-owned land and rural collective land. In the process of urbanization, land development right is an important space for the government to regulate and control urbanization. The second part is the characteristics of the main characteristics of urbanization in China. So in China, there is a long-term formation of the spatial framework. The structural framework of China's urbanization development was established in the early days of the founding of the new China in 1949 and was constantly improved and repeatedly realized in the 40 years of the reform and opening up. The second is it is an industrial development and urbanization process. In China, the premise of Chinese urbanization development is national industrialization and modernization. Urbanization as a restrictive factor has been attached to and given way to the development of the industrialization for a relative long term. The third is that there are different status characteristics of urbanization. The development stage of China's urbanization is generally from restraint to opening, from passive to active, from the urban development to urban agglomeration development, from regional urban economic integration to global urban network participation and competition. The third part is a brief introduce about the model, the main model of the Chinese urbanization construction. I think there are four periods, the four stages. The first stage is the exploratory period of 1980s, urban recovery and industrialization. It reflects the relationship between the industrial development and urbanization model. In different stages of industrialization, industrial driving is the basic driving force of urbanization. The transformation process of industrial structure, different industrial situation and development characteristics have promoted different urbanization development models. The process of the centralized industrialization often promote the rapid development of big cities through industrial agglomeration. At the beginning of the founding of the New China in 1949, the development model of heavy industry promote the repeated development of big cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. After the reform and opening up with the industrial chain industrialization process and the needs of active and flexible industrial division of labor, the repeat continuous development of the small towns have promoted the repeat development of China's Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta, which is the most significant feeder of the Chinese urbanization, entering a new rising period after the reform and opening up. In this period, there are three models that is very important. The first is the old city innovation. The second is the establishing a development zone. The third is the township industrialization. Yeah, we can see from the four pictures, it shows about the big city of Shanghai. In that time, the old city innovation, a lot of the low-rise buildings was demolished. Since then, a lot of the high-rise building was built up in the center of the cities. These three pictures shows a small city in Zhejiang, Lehigh. The three stages of Zhejiang, Lehigh city. The first picture shows the ancient city, the landscape of the old city. In the middle picture shows in the 1990s, the new industrial areas just around the old city. The third picture shows the reconstruction of the new areas environment. It also shows the redemolished of the industrial areas and rebuilt for the landscape, lake, and other residential districts. This case is the urban design of the East New District of Zhejiang, of Zhengzhou, is in the Henan province. It's an urban design competition won by Japanese architects. Since then, it was built up about all the same as the competition design projects. This project shows the Zhejiang Yiwu city. It's a small city, but it has the world's largest small commodity wholesale market. In that time, different cities have different way for their economic increase. In this city, they built up the largest small community wholesale market. It's very famous in China. Almost a lot of the models sell for the whole world. The second stage is the acceleration period of 1990s. In that time, industrial agglomeration and urban modernization promotion. It reflects the relationship between the government place-oriented and the market function in the process of urbanization. The construction of the nation's strategy special zone has formed regional pool from Shenzhen, Pudong of Shanghai, and the Binhai new areas of Tianjin. The new function areas of the city have been gradually expanded, and the increase of the reform of opening up to outside world has made the construction of the central business zone development rapidly in the central city, which has changed the development of the direction and the overall spatial structure of the city, and promote the formation of the regional competition. The development of the high-tech industrial under the background of the global scientific and technological innovation has promoted the expansion of the University Science and Technology Park and the Science and Technology Innovation City. Yeah, these are the two main models in that time. Urban function expansion model, for example, the CBD areas, the Science Park, and the University Park. And the regional competition gradually formed, especially in the period Delta, Shenzhen Special Zone, Yangtze River Delta in Pudong New Area, and Beijing Tianjin Hebei area. So we can see in that time the urban function expands a lot. A lot of the reconstruction of the residential areas in the new city. Yeah, it's the case of in the Beijing old city. And also a lot of the commercial development in that time. Yeah, this case shows the Sanliturn areas in Beijing is a commercial development area in 1990s. And also the financial street development in that time is the case of the Beijing Financial Street. It demolished a lot of the Siheyuan courtyard areas and built up the new buildings for the financial uses. Yeah, this is the science park. Also is in Beijing Zhongguancun West District. Also demolished a lot of the small low-rise buildings and built up the new buildings for the science park for the offices. Yeah, we can see demolished the old part of the city and built up the new buildings for the office for the scientific companies. At that time, three leading economic regions with repeat urbanization and competition. The first is the south of China. It's one of the most densely urbanized region in the world and is an economic hub of city. The left is the Futian city center of Shenzhen, and the right is the Zhujiang new areas in Guangzhou. These two pictures is rendering, but after 15 or 20 years, the two cities was built up. Is the Guangzhou Zhujiang new town, and this is the Shenzhen Futian new center areas. And another region is the east of China. In the east of China, there are two important cities. The first is Hangzhou. The second is another is Shanghai. We can see from the right three pictures shows in the Shanghai Pudong areas only about 20 years. It was a build-up of the new Pudong areas.
Sorry, Professor Bian, I have to interrupt you. So you have 2 minutes to end your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it's Pudong and it's Hangzhou new city. The third region is in north of China, is Beijing and Tianjin. Yeah, is the CBD of Beijing and also the Yujiapu CBD center areas of Tianjin. And another part is in the southwest of China, Chengdu and Chongqing. We also can see the build up in a very short times. Is in Chengdu. So the third stage is high speed of the 2000 years regional link and information driven. It further inflects that the fundamental driving force in the process of urbanization lies in the competition relationship between city and the regions. Yeah, we can see a lot of the new areas was built up. It's designed by Italian architects associates. It's in Shanghai, the Pujiang new city. Is in the Shanghai Hongqiao Airport Industrial Zone. Also, the third model is in the Speed Rail New Town in Suzhou. The first stage is the stable period in the decades, urban and rural integration and the new urbanization leading. Yeah, we can see in this part, the micro stage is the special reconstruction, and micro renewal is about the urban regeneration. Is the new subcenter of Beijing. Yeah, The subcenter of Beijing is the Tongzhou subcenter, is the computation projects. Yeah, it's the highlight projects of the computation. So two discussion, I think, is important place based in the process of China urbanization. Yeah, the first is registered residence place, the relationship between the registered residence place and the population mobility in the process of China. Population mobility is the object demands for employment allocation in the development of the whole society, and is also the most positive factor in the promotion of the city industrial in the process of urbanization. The second is the land policy, the relationship between rural land policy and the land development in the process of urbanization. In China, there are differences between the urban and the rural land systems, also determine the central government control over land development rights through planning, approve, land transition, and other links, which can enable the central and the local governments to have greater initiative in the direction, scale, and the speed of urban land and the development for the periods. It's also a process of urbanization with strong socialist characteristics to realize the social benefit through intensive development with more economic land. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bian, to bring us back to the process of urbanization of China in the past 4 decades. And through your analysis on the 4 phases of urbanization, again, we can feel the transition of urbanization mode. So that means in different period of time, actually China also saw different modes of urbanization, which is again related to the keyword of transition. And also it's important that at the end of your presentation, you mentioned 2 most important policies which may make China's urbanization quite different from that of many Western countries. So thank you again. So I think now we can move on with our discussion. So firstly, I think I will put forward questions to the 4 speakers. I would like to firstly to put forward the questions to Professor Amin and Professor Liu regarding a question how we can interpret urbanness, or in other words, urbanity. I mean, even though we are talking about urbanization in China, but actually urbanization is a common trend of the world, especially since the 20th century. But it seems that in different countries or different regions, people have different interpretation about what is urban and what is urban life. And probably we can use the term of urbanity. So I think that might be interesting that you can give us some of your understanding from the cultural perspective. So probably we can start from Professor Amin.
Thank you. It's a big question. I mean, for me, urbanity means those spatial forms in which the infrastructural and the architectural, the design, the built environment becomes really quite powerful in the shaping of human and natural life. So, this is why we talk about cities and cityness. And what really interests me about urbanity in this regard, and I use the phrase urbanicity in my presentation, was what difference does it make to life and to nature if you think through the built form, think through agglomeration, think through the juxtaposition of diversity and the assembly or the assemblage of living and dead systems, or technologically living systems and human living systems together. So it's that it's the nexus of the co-location of difference on the human side and on the physical side, the extreme kind of building up of materiality and the relationship between the two, that for me is simultaneously urbanity, but also the condition of urbanicity in the history of settlement.
Okay, I put forward this question because when you talk about the mental health of the migrants, and probably they really suffered from the pressure of urban life in big cities like Shanghai, but in some sense, it's still much better than the life if they stay in the rural area, and particularly. Think about probably mental health is a big issue for the first migrants. For the second generation, they might be already used to the new urban life. So that, again, depends on their understanding of urbanity and also probably their expectation to the urbanity.
Yeah, I mean... Look, I think that was pretty much the point of my presentation, that the rural people coming into the city, they come into a very alien environment, extremely alien environment. And the expectation is that they will go crazy because of it. And the ground reality shows that nothing like that happens, because the city then breaks down into a series of domesticated spaces, or spaces in which people, as Professor Liu made it very clear, that the living of the environment is a way in which you domesticate that environment, and when that happens, then your subjectivity is naturally altered, including your mental state.
Okay, so I will move on to Professor Liu, both referring to my question, but also one question from the audience. How did you design the periodic table of space? And what are the basic guidelines and the dimensions? Could you please illustrate with some examples?
I will first answer the audience question. The periodical table is actually designed by two axes. On the horizontal axis, on the left is the subjective agency. On the right is the technological agency. So basically, the periodical table is developed by its degree of whether the subjective intervention or the technological intervention. So there's different degrees in between. And then the vertically is basically a typological categorization. That's a singular place, dual place, three, and then multiple places or cluster of places. So I start to be interested in the new kind of a hybrid place. For example, the new technology make you to be possible to be present at two different places at the same time. So at that moment, these two places has to be understood as an integrated one. So this is a new form of place that's enabled by technology. So I think the technology actually allows a typology of place based on this kind of grouping categorization, and then in terms of agency between the subjective and the technological. So I discovered 66, but it's not an kind of exhaustion of all the possibilities. So I suppose there might be more. And also, I think it's quite interesting to it's not to radically separate the contemporary and the traditional. So, for example, the improvisation place. For example, there were many traditional Chinese places that only make sense in the springtime or the autumn time. So, and also, for example, in the Chinese garden, that the plays were augmented by literature, or for example, the naming and the couplet. So these are all also the historical forms of hybrid or augmented plays. So I try to categorize this augmented plays from this kind of a categorization that does not radically separate the contemporary and the traditional. And then for each type, each card, I give it a definition and also an example to illustrate this particular type. And then addressing Professor Liu's question, my understanding of urbanity is, I think it's the core of urbanity is infrastructure, either the kind of material or technical infrastructure and the cultural or social infrastructure that allows people to living together and to share some of their social functions and social needs. So I think the core of urbanity is about sharing part of your life with others via a system. So that's my understanding of the urbanity.
Okay, thank you very much for this short but very precise answer. I think for me, probably urbanity is really goes to collective. So that means we have a collective life in a dense environment. For that, we need infrastructure to support this kind of dense and collective life. So I will move on. There's a question from the audience. What could be the possible scenario of the future relationship between urbanization and the conservation, in particular, talking about historical domains, historical districts, and industrial heritage? I may put forward this question to Professor Bian, referring to your work in Beijing with the conservation of the historical districts. Professor Bian, can you answer this question?
Okay, thank you for Professor Liu. It's a very important question about the conservation of the city. And actually in China, there are a lot of old cities with preserved, but part of the cities was demolished in the past repeatedly urbanization periods. Especially in Beijing, the old city is about 60 square kilometers. Only about half of the cities was preserved. And another part was rebuilt, the high-rise buildings, especially in the old city and nearly the forbidden city. So it's a big problem. But I think now most of the local government and the experts and the residents has know that the historic heritage is very important for the cities, not only in the residential historic districts, but also the industrial heritage. In Beijing, a lot of the industrial heritage has preserved recently and changed a lot. This part of the industrial heritage, one part was changed for the recreation parks for the local peoples, and another part is for the art and office buildings. So I think in the future, the historic conservation for the old cities will be balanced with the urbanization for the development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think even though we are still in the process of urbanization, but urbanization probably doesn't mean necessarily occupying more land. And we have to think about how we can revital the urban areas that already exist and try to make better use of the land, which concerns the historical buildings, industrial heritages, and historical districts. Now there is another question from the audience. I think I will give this question to Brent. So is there any difference, particularity in the current or future trends of Chinese urbanization from those of Europe and the US? So probably based on your understanding of Chinese cities, Brent. Brent, sorry, we cannot hear you. Again, I think you are still muted. Yes,
Am
please.
Am I audible?
Okay. Yeah, now.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
The short answer is no, but a longer answer would be yes, there are some differences. But I think the overall trends are the same, which is that the human species is an urban species, and that the contemporary technological economy seems to demand that to increase your income, that you have to move to an urban area. So as we see in China, I think quite similarly to perhaps the United States more than Europe, we see a strong confluence of a bifurcation of what we could think of as well-developed cities and then left behind areas. In the United States, we obviously see the catastrophic political implications of that economic trend as well. Europe is a little bit different because Europe is fragmented into many different countries, which have all had independent economies, at least up until recently. But I think if you're to look at the countries of maybe Italy or Germany, some of the larger, and Spain as well, some of the larger countries in Europe, you see the same trend. Typically, the most successful cities are on the coast, with a few exceptions, or the cities are concentrated in one part of the area, one part of the country's area or another. So I think we're seeing a similarity in terms of differentiation of regions. And with neoliberalism and inequality, a kind of lack of state support that varies by country, we see that those left behind areas are severely disadvantaged. Italy, for example, has huge numbers of shrinking villages, as does China, as does the United States. So in that sense, the trends are quite similar. Of course, when you get in and look at the particularities of the cities themselves are quite different, which has to do as well with sort of political patterns of planning as much as it has to do with overall globalization. Thank you.
Yes, I think I completely agree with you that in some sense there are common trends, but it's always, you can always find differences. And then I have another question to Brent. Actually, you talk about the plural urban design, and I'm thinking, and also you mentioned that urban design is always in completion, and especially regarding the new cities. So what do you think of the role of urban design when we try to plan and design new towns?
Thank you, Jian, for the question. I think that, first of all, I think the concept of a new town is a project. It's an aesthetic, but also political, economic, and social project that is descended from modernism. And modernism is in turn descended from the Beaux-Arts projection of the industrial city. So I think the concept of the new town requires some substantial updating. I don't think that the concept itself is flawed. I think that in a rapidly growing economy, a new locus for economic activities and new locations for dwellings are needed. But the concept of a new town as a perfectly designed entity, analogous in some ways to a utopian city, I think is an impossible task and one that hasn't worked particularly well. Most new towns themselves are sort of incomplete, and the British new town experience shows that new towns are not viewed as entirely satisfactory environments. So when I was preparing my presentation for this seminar, I took a look a little bit more closely at David Crane's new town. Quite a revolutionary example, in fact, of new town design, where he imagined that the planner or the designer, and I want to note that he saw them as the same individual, would design a framework for economic activities. They would design some significant buildings, and they would design some districts, the high level of resolution, but they would leave other parts of the district open and remaining for completion later. In other words, if we design a new town as a final entity, we're not going to succeed. So I think we see in all of these utopian renderings of beautifully designed new towns, I'm sorry to say I don't think they'll be realized, but I think a new town that allows for flexible design might achieve a lot more success. And as just two more examples, I want to provide the examples of Milton Keynes and Chandigarh. Both of these were new towns that were designed along grids. And the utility of the grid is that it's pretty easy to extend and everybody understands it. So Milton Keynes was designed with a flexible grid that could be expanded over time. And it didn't really matter what was designed inside the grid. That was left up to the individual designer. So Milton Keynes, in fact, accommodated pluralism quite successfully. And it's proved to be one of the highest quality of life areas of the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Yeah. Probably, I don't know if I may add one point is that when we design new town, we not only design a physical environment, actually we design a new kind of life. I think this is a phenomenon we can feel from Chinese new towns. So when you compare the new areas in Beijing, which are completely different from the old city of Beijing, because we have to be adapted to the new economy and the new social life. So thank you very much. I think I will give the last question to Michele, who is also in the meeting room. Michele, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jian. Just a question that is also inspired from Brent, definition of the pluralist new town, the last slide by Brent. But this question is addressed mostly to the two Chinese speakers, or also to you, maybe Liu Jian. Is that if I can recap, Bian showed to us a general structure, a general organization of the city planning that has some very clear direction, following some rules, some central rules. And then in the Andong presentation, we noticed that at the level of a small project, this very straight organization became a multiplicity of 1,000 projects, 1,000 creative approaches, a lot of different projects in the city. So I would like to know from you as expert of a Chinese city, which is, if you agree, of course, and then which point of the process became from very straight planning with some rules very well defined to a multiplicity of creative approaches and projects. So I ask to any of you would like to give an answer to this.
So, Professor Bian, would you please answer first?
Yeah, can you repeat
Yes.
the question? Other than Michele's question, can you repeat for me?
So the question is how, in a certain period of time, China make a top-down planning for large-scale development. But nowadays, there are more and more small-scale regeneration in urban areas. So how you evaluate this kind of change?
Yeah. So I'm so excited to hear the Professor Luandong's presentation to show us about very interesting cases about China's from the bottom to top of the urban regeneration cases. I think in China, the urbanization period is very. The first is from the top to bottom. The national policy is very important to promote the process. But on the other hand, the market and from the bottom to top, a lot of the cases, a lot of the local government and the different real estate, the companies, they do a lot of works. So recently, I think from the local peoples, they participate the urban regeneration. So I think the situation changed recently. But I think the first period is important. It's very important for the government to lead the process. But now the people join the process, do a lot of works. It's also very important. My opinion, you can, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Professor Lu, do you have any more comments on that?
I totally agree with Professor Bian's opinion. I want to supply a kind of small anecdote. So, for example, the case I've shown are primarily from the very large cities, the first tier of cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. So I think it's quite interesting that it's actually in those super large cities that the bottom-up kind of force or has its power. So I think it's a little bit dangerous to talk about China's urban regeneration in general. And also, I think the urban regeneration is not kind of separated by regions. I think it's more by a kind of inherent power of cities. So, for example, those small autonomous regeneration projects are more successful and also more common in very few super large cities. But then for the most of the other cities, they are less common, I have to admit. So I think it's quite interesting that actually I think probably we need to categorize the approach of regeneration by the kind of nature of city rather than its location or other different characters. Yeah,
okay,
that's supply my opinion on that. Thank you.
Okay, if I may add one more comment, I think that's also because the awareness of private ownership, property ownership. So I think when there is more awareness of private property ownership, there will be more people involved in urban regeneration because that really concerns their own individual interests. So I think in view of time, we will go to the last question, which goes to Brent. There is a question from the audience. Plurality, when it comes to agents, is in continuous evolution. So what is the today plural might not be the same of tomorrow? How can we deal with it? Again, Brent, we cannot hear you. Okay, good.
I'm audible now?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that question. And I don't want to sound like I'm giving a facile or lighthearted response. But when I talk about incompletion being inevitable as well as change, the fact that plural agents will be different tomorrow is part and parcel of pluralism. So what I like about the concept of pluralism is that, first of all, it reflects reality. Cities are, in fact, plural. It's the way cities are, whether we want them to be or not. And the bigger a city gets, the more plural it becomes. But the fact that what the pluralism of tomorrow will be different from the pluralism today, it's still a form of pluralism. So what I hope to find is an urban design that doesn't have to exist as a preserved monument, but an urban design that can convey a utopian or at least improved vision of the aesthetic city, but that can persist as pluralism shifts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent. I think I may conclude with the term of transitional urbanness because, there's always eternal changes. So we are always in the process of transition. So even though we are talking about urbanization today in China, then tomorrow there might be more new challenges, new changes, then we have to deal with. At the end of this session, I thank again for the four speakers for your excellent presentations and also for your kind contribution in the discussion. So I think I will hand over the microphone to Michele or Maria Paula. I think that will be the end of the first session.
Thank you, Professor Liu.
Thank you very much also from my side to the first speakers. And thank you, Jian, for the today co-moderation that is renovating the very nice collaboration, setting up the exhibition together. So welcome to the second session of our China Goes Urban seminar. It will be shorter, but not less important. Two speeches will be given by Forsyth from Harvard University and Bernhard Müller from TU Dresden. So one interesting point is that both titles, without coordinating before, just as a proposal, begins with the word towards 21st century new towns, in the first case, towards urban sustainability through socially integrated city, in the second case. I think this choice of both speakers is expressing very well a focus on the transformative capacity while we move from theories, from urban theories to practice. So I think these titles express and introduce very well the topic of our second section that is about urban practices. A second point in common is that both speeches will have a social focus, a focus on social sustainabilities. And I think that today we are doing together a kind of experiment because I think we are adding virtually, of course, a fifth point to the 4 points that Francesca introduced before to explain our work about the exhibition. It's like we are adding a new section of the exhibition that borrowing a keyword that Amin used before, that was the cities seen from below, let's say from the ground, where the human activity happens. I see that we are focusing a lot in many of our reflections on the relation between urban space and human collectivity. That is something we would like to add maybe to our exhibition virtually. So I start giving the floor to Anne Forsyth, that is going to publish next December a book that is about 21st century new towns, and the subtitle is A Guide to Planned Communities Worldwide. Few words about Anne. She's professor of urban planning at Harvard University. She's also the co-leader of both the Healthy Place Design Lab and the New Towns Initiative of Harvard University. So please, Anne, the floor is yours for your speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conference. Oh, yes, yeah, and you can hear me. I'm going to step back a bit and look at the broad picture of the 20th century legacy and 21st century future of new towns. Oh, good, my slides are up. New towns as we know them today really emerged as a response to industrialization and urban growth, going through an international global golden age in the mid-1940s through the mid-1970s, a term from Wakeman. Since the 2000s, they've re-emerged in China, India, Africa, and elsewhere. and new towns or new town style planning is poised to be relevant for a number of coming challenges. New towns are not a panacea, as we've already heard. They're difficult to pull off, and there are many underwhelming examples, but they're relevant in terms of their lessons for the current period. So the talk draws on research I've done over the past 30 years, most recently a book co-edited with Rick Pizer and about to be published. And that book reviews the new town experience in the 20th and 21st centuries around the world, looking at how well they perform in various dimensions from quality of life to economic performance. In this book, we also compiled an inventory of new towns that had reached a population of at least 30,000 by 2015. My thanks to Adam Tanaka and numerous other contributors to the book who worked on that. There were over 500 of these substantial new towns started in the 20th century and many more since. And in the book, we did include other smaller developments, but in the inventory that I'll talk about, we needed to have some parameters for bounding it. So as you can see, we look at the past and the future in the book. Of course, this requires one to define new towns, and like many others, we focus on their being large, comprehensive, and new. It is hard to define them, however. For instance, we don't look at large-scale redevelopments of existing areas, the new town, in town, even though there's lots of common features. It can be very hard to define the exact starting date and area, and also to figure out the current status of a development that might have started off as a freestanding satellite and now be part of the suburban outer fringe. We also tried to have developments that were comprehensive, not mainly residential or mainly industrial, but it's a spectrum and it can be hard to define. But we thought it was worthwhile to try, and in broad cases, in a sort of broad sense, they provide a worthwhile inventory. So just to help us center our thinking about this experience, I'd like you to just think for a moment about a well-known new town of the 20th century. I was actually going to make this interactive and have you talk to us in chat, but it turns out that you can't do it with this software. But I'm imagining that you should be thinking of something that's, say, internationally well-known, the kind of new towns that form the common language of planners and designers. And what I imagine you have thought of is a mix of different types. Some will be classic early 20th new towns and garden cities, represented here by Letchworth, north of London, started as a non-profit. Others will have imagined mid-20th century new towns, in this case, the finely crafted modernist Vällingby outside Stockholm in Sweden. Still, others would have thought of the other major sort of group of mid-20th century new towns, private developments like Reston in the US outside Washington, DC. And while most of the images in the lectures are my own photos, this is one of Alexander Garvin's from the New Towns book. And of course, there may be those thinking about the late 20th century. This development in Songjiang outside Shanghai is actually early 21st century, and I'll talk more about that. And the image is from 2011, showing how fast these Chinese new towns were developed, something I'm going to talk about later as the instant new town. And those of us who are into new towns may have personal favourites that are more obscure. One of my favourites is Cumbernauld in Scotland, and another is Jamshedpur in India, both mid-century. But the sort of well-known ones are a common language in planning and design. The inventory we created both confirmed and also expanded upon these common perceptions. This is a chart of new towns in the 20th century for countries with 5 or more, again, reaching 30,000 by 2015. By far, the majority of 20th century new towns were in Russia. And as I'll show later, there was a high period of such Russian new town development in the early part of the 20th century. The vast majority of Russian new towns were for industrial development purposes. And indeed, roughly half the total 20th century inventory had a purpose of economic development. These included industrial, research, and military towns. Of course, giving something a main purpose is a fairly rough designation, and places often have multiple rationales, but it's striking how much employment and industrial development mattered. It is also very hard to know how finely crafted these Russian new towns were. Many may have been quite grim, but they are an important part of the 20th century legacy. Second in the charts is the US, which has had a large program that have been privately developed, only occasionally with some government support. This is interesting given the idea that new towns of the 20th century were a government affair, requiring substantial top-down coordination. Most of these new towns in the US were for metropolitan deconcentration, by which we mean they were meant to provide a planned alternative to sprawl. Indeed, in the inventory, a very large group, over 40%, were for the purpose of deconcentration. China is third in terms of numbers in the 20th century, although this has helped in that it includes Hong Kong, and is largely, though not exclusively, from the 60s through the early 90s. The latest burst of development is really a 21st century phenomenon. This phase of Chinese new town development were a mix of industrial cities and satellites for deconcentration. India, the fourth in the list, had most of its new towns after the 1940s, with again a mix of purposes, but they also included refugee resettlement after partition and new capitals. And then after that come many places that you visited if you are interested in new towns in the UK, Japan, Singapore, Korea, and so on. This slide starts to, sorry, the clicker's not working. This slide starts to unpack the 20th century experience and also the first part of the 21st century in the bottom bar. Again, with new towns that had reached 30,000 by 2015. So for the recent decades, the numbers will be growing. On the left is the total number of new towns in the inventory, and on the right are countries with the most new town starts that decade, when there was somewhere that had at least 5 in a decade. So top to bottom, in green, you can see how important the Russian new town experience was in the first half of the 20th century. Indeed, if you look at Russia and the Eastern Bloc, including their technical assistance to places like China and India, they had a very large influence. Of the over 270 employment-based new towns in the 20th century, about 2/3 of those had a socialist impetus. Looking at the blue section, you can clearly see the golden period from the 1940s through the 1970s. Indeed, and it really sort of fell off a cliff after that. In 1999, I started research for my 2000 book on the US new towns of Irvine, Columbia, and the Woodlands that had started in the 60s and 70s. I framed that research as looking at these new towns as early examples of smart growth. And they had used these approaches early enough so that I could evaluate them over time. And when I told people I was researching new towns, they would actually ask me, why bother to look at new towns? No one builds them anymore. And I actually responded, yes, that's right. But they have planning strategies worth studying. Of course, at that time in 1999, the current boom was about to start, but it was not yet obvious. And finally, the orange section shows the start of Chinese expansion. However, it's actually a bit misleading because most of the new towns in the 1990s were started in the early part of the decade, making the sort of the takeoff in the 2000s all the more striking. And again, we had counted around 50 new towns with populations at 30,000 by 2015, but there will be a lot more now. And from the grey bar at the bottom, which is still growing, you'll see that there is this new second golden age or a second boom. Finally, on the inventory, I just want to show this golden age and new golden age. in terms of the distribution and diversity internationally. Really don't focus on the absolute numbers. It's hard to define a new town. But again, you can see that new towns in the period of the 40s to 70s grew in numbers and grew in distribution around the world. By the 70s, they were starting in many countries across the globe. Then after the economic changes of the 1970s, there was a dramatic drop to rise again, most notable in the first decade of this century in China. Before ending this section, I need a caveat. Oh, I think I have to. This image, which should be clicking forward. Oh no, come on, image. Is of the small nitrate town of Maria Elena in Chile from a chapter on the book by Felipe Correa. And it's here to remind us that the charts I've shown are not the whole picture. There are many smaller developments that also form the new town history, whether freestanding towns like this one or ones that we might call new town style neighborhoods, with design features perhaps of new towns, but not a comprehensive balance of uses. It's a rich history beyond the inventory. So having looked at the 20th century legacy, I want to briefly examine the rationales behind this history before moving on to look at the future. These draw on several chapters of the book that look at new towns historically and in terms of quality of life outcomes by Freestone, Morans, myself, and others. I'm going to go over this more briefly to try and pick up time for the rest of the group. When you think about the future, you need to think about the past and why people bothered with new towns. Well, they did it for several reasons. There were economic and demographic goals. Given the alternative, which was often sprawl, could populations go to better locations and help economic development? Some of this movement was to satellites of major cities and other new areas, but these were macro level rationales. From the urban planning perspective, there were many perceived better benefits, better urban patterns, comprehensive and balanced uses, social goals such as economic and racial equity, developing efficiently to save costs, having innovation in planning and design. And for businesses and governments, they could deliver specific priorities, including nation building. And for these reasons, people tried new towns across the globe. But the new town experiment was not always successful, even with a picture from one of my favorite ones in Cumbernauld. It's been hard to prove that they actually had benefits. Many didn't reach their target populations. They were hard to start, to find land and resources. As the development spread over years, they faced challenges with changing political and economic contexts. Encouraging people to come to a new place was not always easy. Socially, people often had high hopes and new towns didn't live up to them. There were new town blues. And with a big new town, it can be hard to have diversity as many similar people move in at once. And it can be even harder to promote interaction. And finally, new towns had a number of other problems: overly experimental design, complex governance, and problems like a lack of affordability that could spill over. So they're not a panacea. So what does that mean for the future of the new towns? And here you can see an image from Calamba, Angola, showing the Chinese engagement outside China in the current century, something highlighted in a book chapter by Keaton and Provost. So what I'm going to do is talk about emerging issues to do with new towns and new town planning styles. So when I'm talking about new towns remaining relevant topically, there are obviously a lot of current urban issues that all urban development needs to engage with, and we deal with in the book. They're broadly about growth, environmental issues, social and economic concerns, and new technologies. And new towns, while not, as I said, a panacea, do have a role and can help focus development away from hazards or scarce resources like agricultural land. They can deal with some of the coming wave of land shortages in a way that could be equitable. They have potential, though it's unrealized, to house some of the coming waves of climate refugees in a more efficient way and improving quality of life. And they could even be models for dealing with demographic shifts like aging by providing more services and housing options. One example of potentially engaging with a contemporary issue is planned retreat that Rick and I have continued to work on after the book with a new article in Landscape and Urban Planning. And in this, we continue the work of David Godstock's chapter in the book, The Last Thing He Wrote Before His Death. As you know, in climate change adaptation, people can try to predict existing development from changes like floods or sea level rise. They can accommodate it by raising development, or they can retreat away. And it's in retreat that there are possibilities for new towns. Retreat is not always a great solution and can lead to problems like climate sprawl as people just disperse across the landscape to find cheaper areas. It can lead to climate gentrification as people move away from hazardous areas and bid up prices in attractive existing places. And it generally can lead to social disconnection as communities are divided. So new towns might be a plausible solution. The example on the left is not one of these examples. It's actually a new town being built in a low elevation zone. And there are lots of ways to plan retreat, but the new town experience can help with two of them. One is going to be more rare when an entire existing settlement moves as a whole to a new place, keeping social and economic ties intact. There are examples around the world, for example, when dams are constructed, but they tend to be small and rural. The other, on the right part of the slide, is for new towns to take people away who are retreating from many places to avoid the problems of climate sprawl and climate gentrification. And there are a lot of lessons for creating socially cohesive and equitable new towns as an alternative to climate sprawl and gentrification. A second way, and this is sort of getting to the end of my talk, to think about the future is not about topics, but about new town planning styles. And to date, there have been two main styles of new town development: comprehensive new towns developed over time, and instant new towns that happen quite quickly because they're either small or because of substantial government influence, like in China. But there are some emerging types of planning: the maturation of older new towns from the Golden Age, the idea of new towns as infrastructure, which is rather like Brent Ryan's example from Crane, where it's a new version of, say, sites and services, providing a comprehensive infrastructure, social and physical, but maybe not whole buildings. And also the continuation of new town-style neighbourhoods, which are not new and are not new towns, but can use some of their lessons. I'm going to focus on maturation planning, which is salient because the Golden Age developments are now 50 to 70 years old. It faces challenges. Perhaps most important is new towns have a complex sense of place. They often started with a fairly strong vision, but people have moved in over the years and that has gone. Perhaps the vision wasn't so good, but perhaps it was. So figuring that out is difficult, and to know what is outdated and what is not. But on the other hand, new towns often have a history of innovation and embracing new activities. And Pascaline Gaberit's chapter on European new towns shows some good examples of new towns embracing the new in our book. And in addition, they have very either active residents or complex governance or both, which can make this whole process of maturation complicated. I've been observing and marginally participating in a planning process in Columbia, Maryland, which was very innovative in terms of both economic and racial integration, as well as the new town development process. And half a century later has to move forward, dealing with a new round of social, ecological, economic, and aesthetic challenges. It's a very interesting and complex process to think about maturation. So now you know something about the 20th century legacy of new towns, with a golden age of from the 1940s through the 1970s and a current second boom. I've discussed some of the rationales and objections to new towns and proposed some plausible futures, both engaging current topics and new styles of planning. I think new towns will never be the majority of development, but their lessons can be useful beyond new towns themselves. And new forms of new town planning, like maturation planning or infrastructural new towns, can expand that influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I appreciated a lot your speech, at least for two reasons. One is because it makes stronger one of the observations made by Francesca in the introduction. She said that Chinese urbanization has very special characteristics, is very big, but actually is not an exception. So you show to us that there is a trend of new urbanization, a new town coming from the last century. And so China is moving on the same trend. And this is one of the reasons, in my opinion, why it's very important to study and to know Chinese urbanization also from the West, also from us. The second reason, I can recap it in the keyword transition. So the move towards 21st century new town was not a strong radical change, but was a step-by-step transition, making raise very crucial points, very crucial elements that you mentioned, like the social concerns about the new town models, or also the environmental issue that is very strong in the change, in the transition of this paradigm. So I know that transition is a very important word in the work by Bernhard Müller, that will be the next speaker, is the head of a Horizon 2020 project exactly about transition towards sustainability of cities in Europe and China. So, but before introducing Bernhard, I would like to remind to the audience that it is already possible to send questions to the chat, to both Anne and Bernhard. So after Bernhard's presentation, we will have a kind of final discussion. So giving the floor to Bernhard Müller, I will remind that he's a senior professor at TU Dresden. After being the director of the Lesmes Institute of Ecological, Urban and Regional Development, is also academician of the Germany Academy of Science and Engineering, and is the leader, the coordinator of Transurban New China project. That is a big project between Europe and China. Also Tsinghua University, Politecnico, and many other partners are part of this project. So I leave the floor to you, Bernhard, your presentation that is co-signed also by Paolina Schiappacasse. Thank you very much for your speech.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I'm very happy and pleased that I'm part of this event and exercise today. I would like to talk about the transition regarding urban sustainability through socially integrative cities. As you mentioned already, I use as well some material and put this together with Paolina Schiappacasse. And well, this event has the title China Goes Urban. So I was reflecting a little bit in the beginning about it. The subtitle is The City to Come. And when you board one of these rapid trains in Beijing or wherever you start your travels in China, you see always similar pictures. These high-rise buildings, many new construction areas, iconic buildings, and so on and so on. When you get out, then of course you see as well the people. But that's the main image. And this means the city to come, we have to ask, is this the new city? Everything has to be new and modern. It has to be smart, of course. So artificial intelligence plays a big role. The so-called smart city concept is very important. Iconic buildings, I mentioned it already, are very up en vogue. High-rise, high density, of course, and very important, I think, if we talk about stakeholders, is that they are developer-driven. Big developers have been involved in urban development and are mainly driving this type of urban development. But on the other hand, we have to ask ourselves as well, when we are driving on these trains, isn't there too much uniformity? It looks, everything everywhere looks rather similar at the first glance, at least. Where's the regional identity? Do we have enough diversity in these, in a way, new town, new metropolitan area developments? Where's the sense of place? How can we detect the sense of place? What about the ghost cities? When I came some years ago to one new place in the evening, everything was dark. So no one was living there. And then I asked a colleague and he said, yeah, I have bought 3 apartments there, but I've never seen them. I've never been there. I just keep them for later. So the ghost cities. And the other question, the human dimension. What about the human dimension as well in urban development? When there is a city to come, we have to ask, is there a city to go? And we see on the left side picture, there is the old parts of the cities, which are, especially when they are close to the urban centers, they are disappearing and the big new high-rise buildings are coming up. We don't know whether this will happen to those places where I took the other pictures. And the other question is as well, what is the city to stay? Which parts of the city will stay and in which form will they stay? And we have seen up to now that those, let's say, parts which stay are mainly historic buildings. They are, in a way, either monuments or they are of a tourist attraction. They are changed into new modern uses, but as well, they are empty. The old population has left. And of course, this is part of the relocation programs. Well, anyhow, we see, and I think this was a part of the other speeches already, there are a lot of urban challenges in China, especially the question of sustainability. And now the people-centered new urbanization is a very important topic. And I have just looked into the proposals for formulating the 14th five-year plan from 2021 to 2025, was just issued recently. And we see that the people-centered new urbanization is in one section of the plan regarding urban development. One of the major issues to be continued and further taken up, and this is a very important point. So from our point of view, from this project which has been mentioned already, maybe we can make some contributions to the further development and thinking through the socially integrative cities. What do we mean by that? The project, first of all, combines, it's a research and innovation action funded by the European Commission, and it brings together 14 prominent partners from China and from Europe. So there's not only Tsinghua and Politecnico, but there are other institutions like Chinese Academy of Urban Planning and Design, or a lot of other institutions, Eurocities, for instance, Chinese Center for Urban Development, and so on, so which are rather high-ranking and very prominent institutions as well. So the idea of this project is, of course, where we start with the cities and the urban development. We know cities are places of dynamics and change. Innovation, lifestyle, quality of life plays a very big role. But we see as well, and we have seen, and we see that in Europe and in China, anywhere in the world, that the rich and the poor, the population who has lived in a place and the newcomers, they're very closely together there. So the city is a conglomerate of different social groups. And the question is there social cohesion? And what about social integration? So these pictures, which I have here on the slide, they are from China and from Europe, and sometimes it's very difficult to differentiate which will be from where. So on this background, the objectives of this undertaking, Transurban EU-China, is how to design and turn cities into intelligent, socially integrative and sustainable environments. We look for good practices and methods in terms of social inclusiveness, cultural dynamics, and economic viability. And it is, in a way, an exercise of transfer and learning based on reciprocity. So it's not a transfer from one side to the other, but a joint learning process. So the first question which we have to ask and answer is, what means a socially integrative city? And we have put together a group of different experts looking at different concepts, and we came to the conclusion that a socially integrative city needs a comprehensive approach. So we understand socially mixed, cohesive, livable, and vibrant communities. Vibrant, especially. Compactness plays a role. Functional mix, intra-urban connectivity. Environmental quality is important. The quality of public spaces, the quality of life, they contribute to the well-being of the population. A sense of community, a sense of place. Preservation of cultural heritage, of course, plays a role and shapes the city's inward and outward image. Investment in neighborhood improvement, infrastructure, and housing are important supportive measures, and the empowerment of participation of the population as well as social capital are indispensable. And we have gone a little bit further, putting together 12 characteristics, put together in 5 groups regarding the different items and topics which one has to look into. And we have it here in Chinese and in English. So I do not want to go into all the details, but urban planning and participatory design, so participation in planning and design, plays a big role according to our understanding. The urban environment, urban environmental initiatives, etc., are important. Local economy, local small chains with narrowness, etc., and markets as well. The local neighbor market, for instance, play an important role. Then social development and social capital is something like the glue of within a society. And if social capital is not there and is difficult to create in a new town, for instance, a new area, then the social integration may not work as fine as otherwise. And finally, of course, the institutional development and urban finance play an important role. I do not want to go further into details, just saying a few words about the different components from which perspectives we look at these topics. On one hand, community building and placemaking in neighborhoods plays a role, bridging the planning implementation gap, where we look especially at the eco and smart city approaches in China and in Europe. Land use and land management, the expansion areas and urban renewal areas are in our focus. And then finally, the integrated transition pathways we're looking at them and looking at how these processes are working. And of course, we're testing different issues within so-called urban living labs. Again, I cannot talk about everything. A lot of that will come out in a book in May 2021, Towards Socially Integrative Cities, Perspectives on Urban Sustainability in Europe and China, with about 15, 16 different authors or articles by different author groups from China and Europe. And we're working on a compendium of tools for socially integrative cities with description of tools, good practice examples, and links and further material for practice. This played a rather big role, and therefore I would like just to have a short look on the issue of the urban living labs concerning urban expansion and urban renewal. So in this framework, we did, of course, first workshops on a workshop on urban living labs, what the meaning is and what it could be in China. As well, there's a big discussion and a big experience in Europe, of course, in other parts of the world as well. But it is a rather difficult concept to convey and to make use of in different environments. So we discussed that. We conducted different in situ workshops in several cities in China in 2018 and 19, and then due to the Corona crisis, we did the rest on online workshops during this year. So I would like to take the example of urban expansion and urban renewal, and in our discussions with Chinese and European colleagues, we came to the conclusion that two very important topics for the future development of socially integrative cities in China and the sustainability discussion is coordination and cooperation on one hand, and participation on the other hand. So with coordination and cooperation, we were looking especially at one instrument, but there are many others, of course, which we have taken up and discussed. But I would like to talk a little bit about the integrated urban development, and then regarding participation, the community, neighborhood planning, and development. So let us have a look at the next one. So if we look at coordination and cooperation, and especially the integrated urban development, then we can say there's a shift from sectoral planning to ensure equal opportunities towards economic, social, and environmental development in an area. So an area-based approach in especially planned urban expansion areas. The identification of priority action areas and projects that becomes important. Planning is not the full coverage of the city anymore, but the priority action plays a role. Horizontal integration, the coordination of sectoral policies on the same level, the different stakeholders on the same level play an important role. And on the other hand, the vertical integration, which goes across the different levels, national, regional, and local. But of course, this is as well at the same time a challenge. So the strengths of the integrated urban development, of course, the sustainable urban development can be much more easily addressed. This is sectoral integration. The local spatial integration is possible through coherence of actions in different locations within a city. Territorial integration as well in the way of the coherence and complementarity of actions and policies. Multi-level governance plays a role there, and stakeholder involvement in implementation. And there we come to the difficulties. The the challenges of integrated urban development, because the effectiveness depends on the stakeholders who are involved, who become involved. So some may want to be there and some are reluctant. The integrated urban development requires cooperative culture within local administration. It needs time to grow and flourish. It requires voluntary cooperation of actors from private sector, from civil society, and as well, this is not easy to get. And it requires professional moderation and mediation skills, as well as monitoring capacities. And again, it is very often that the stakeholders think they can do everything by themselves. And at the end, they often fail. Informal documents, that's another point, because what you get is you get an accord of how you do something, but this is not formally binding. And in a culture or in cultures which are looking for the formally binding documents, this may not be too much liked. But of course, there are a lot of good cases. So we discussed some of them. Here I put some European experience on this slide. In urban renewal, such documents like you see on the left-hand side from different countries, different cities, you see that they are the basis, for instance, for demolition, for new public green spaces, for instance, or new developments as well, new places coming up. There may be support for refurbishment of privately owned buildings in the individual sphere. Then the improvement of public spaces in general, the streets, the improvement of the environmental assets like green space and new economic life and social interaction can be forwarded and encouraged through such documents. And you see an example here from the city of Freiburg, a new development, a new town, so to say, a new urban expansion area of the city, which has a lot of diversity because the public and private sector, they were working from the beginning with each other, and the public sector did not give the whole area to one developer, but divided the development in very different parts and included stepwise more and more people living there, so that the design could be very much oriented towards the needs of the population. This is the case of the integrated urban development. Let us look at the next one, the participation. Sorry, yes, okay. Participation. We looked at community planning, neighborhood planning in China as well. Of course, it's a collaborative and participatory approach, and we can talk very easily about it, yeah? But to do it is the difficulty here. It's oriented towards the activation and engagement of the local population in order to define community-based priorities. We have seen in many cases, as well in Chinese urban renewal, that this is a very important but very difficult part, that people may want to take the compensation for their property and move somewhere else and leave the rest to the public sector or developer instead of becoming involved. So I think it's the question of mindset which we have to take into consideration. Then it allows the community to become involved in all steps and to develop a sense of ownership over planning and development. And it encompasses, after consultation and cooperation among different stakeholders and the community, the formulation of long-range visions, policies, and strategies. But again, we have a lot of benefits and challenges. So among the benefits are the needs of communities. They have to be understood, they have to be known. they have to be elaborated as well. Getting and keeping volunteers involved is not easy. Prioritizing issues, presenting ideas and proposals, the networking with other communities to maximize the impact, or knowing how decisions are made by councils and others is very important there. And one is able to work in partnership with elected representatives, council, public agencies, and so on. But the challenges are rather big, because community planning can't be developed without a strong, motivated, encouraged local community members. It's time-consuming, as I said, and for a fast-growing country and urbanization process, like in China during the last decades, this may be much too time-consuming. I hope one gives the time in the future. And of course, it requires resources to integrate and keep stakeholders in the process. And it's difficult to avoid that only a limited number of always the same people show up in meetings, for instance. So again, we have a few issues here. For instance, in Northampton in United Kingdom, another new town, Upton, which was created some years ago, they did a very interesting process, an inquiry by design process, which brought together all different kinds of stakeholders to see what kind of a design code should be developed. And they did it in 2 steps. They had public hearings, and a lot of other issues came up. And finally, this led to the formulation of a design code for the new area. The results were that, again, very distinct identities. They are, up to now, a signature element of that area. They're safe and pleasant, easy to move around, sense of welcome, the adaptability and resource efficiency were among the results there. But of course, participation is as well discussed, and neighborhood planning is discussed in China. And I refer to one of our colleagues from the Wuhan Land Use and Urban Spatial Planning Research Center, who works very closely with us. So where he looks into neighborhood planning, which is, as he says, still in its initial and exploratory stage in China. It's a relatively new type of planning. And with urban expansion still top-down, residence committees and community planning are not yet key players. We have to think in the street committees, residence committees, which are an institution in China, which could be much more involved, but up to now, they're not involved in these planning and strategic issues. So community planning as well plays an exploratory and supplementary role in urban renewal, as he says. And of course, there are good practice examples with involvement in planning. Special concerns are taken up. There are regular meetings, and more the social media are coming up that in WeChat groups, the participatory planning is promoted. But there are as well challenges which reflect the specific Chinese background, so which are related to the policy design and legal support. So, for instance, the National Policy Foundation, which would be very important, laws and regulations that give room for more participation, the accountability and responsibilities have to be set up. Local governments and the planning context, the residence committees, I mentioned them already, they could have a much bigger role maybe in planning, neighborhood planning. Financial, human resource support are a challenge, and the institutions and mechanisms for planning implementation. And finally, the sense of community and participation in planning. So the collective sense of community, is it really existing? How can it be focused and fostered? The experience, degree, and platform of public participation, and then the planning procedures. What kind of influence would more participation have here? So a lot of discussions which have to be discussed. And I'm always astonished about one fact in China. When you come to a larger city, my first walk is always to go to one of these wonderful planning exhibition halls. So my question is, why they show the new developments, they show the ready-made products, but why don't they become more the platform for interaction and debate and take up more initiative in this direction? So with this, I would like to come to my concluding remarks. We said that China goes urban, and this is perfect. The debate on the city to come is open. The city, the debate about the city to go and the city to stay, I think, have to be included here. Then there are many urban challenges in the years to come. The people-centered new urbanization provides the guidance, I think, for the future. And I'm especially happy that this seems to be playing a role in the forthcoming 5-year plan, which will provide support for that. And of course, we in the project, we look for socially integrative city, enhance the exchange and experience. We develop concepts and tools for the city to come. We think they exist. They have to be revisited and further developed and adapted to the local conditions. In coordination and cooperation on one hand, as well as participation and activation of the local population on the other hand, they play a central role. Good practice examples exist, but they are not the mainstream. And we have seen some good examples today, but I doubt that they are yet in the mainstream. So the debate needs to be continued. With this, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much to you, Bernhard. So with this final sentences, the debate needs to be continued. I think we can start right now. We have still time for a final discussion. So I would like to start from your key point of questioning what the city to come should be or will be, and focusing precisely on the keyword of new. So new town, new urbanization was a very important word today, and inspired by a question from the audience. I read the question as arrived. How to look towards the concept of new that comes from a specific socio-eco demand as well as political purpose, avoiding spatial nostalgia. So this was the question from the public. I would like to add that actually is very difficult studying Chinese new town to really understand what is new. For instance, during our fieldwork, was not easy to recognize even a new town, because what is called new town, new district, new area is something very different. Sometimes they are neighborhoods, new neighborhoods within the existing cities, not really like a satellite city. So I would like to ask maybe both of you, starting from Anne, that has this long time overview on the history of new town. What is new for you in the concept of new town? What does it mean? It is a new construction, new collectivity, new ideas about architecture and urbanization. So if you give us an inspiration about this, we will be very grateful. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting. I am actually honestly less worried about the aesthetics. And I think I'm a bit with Brent Ryan on this. So a new town takes new land, although it could be land that's been used for something else before, and creates a new development with a new social organization. And some of them do better than others at making that new land be developed efficiently and well in terms of the environment, and it helping that new social order to come together. over time using various processes. I actually think the physical space is, of course, what's getting built, but the architecture is rather secondary. And in fact, it's been when people were trying to be very experimental in the architecture that new towns have often had problems. I think they can be experimental in the sort of infrastructural level. They can experiment with processes for recreating patterns of social life. But the parts of new towns that have been demolished over time have often been those that are very experimental. That's not to say that you can't have a sort of more contemporary architectural form. I think of Freiburg or Hammarby Hofstad, a number of others that have a more contemporary form. But I think the new happens on other levels, the infrastructural, the land, the people, rather than having to have a whole new architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah, okay.
Please, Bernhard.
Yes, okay. I would like to continue with what has been just said. Of course, when we look at new towns or new urban developments, I'm looking at it a little bit more comprehensive way, not just limiting it to the discussion to new separate towns, satellite towns, or something like that, because I think urban renewal and urban expansion, if we look at China, is very much merged. It goes very much hand in hand. And it's, as you said already, it's difficult to differentiate. But no, definitely we should avoid a spatial or cultural or whatever nostalgia. That's I fully agree. But when we look at the new, we have first the first impression is the infrastructure, the built-up environment, the houses, everything is new. I mean, usually the new developments, they start with a tabula rasa situation. So now in urban development, in urban renewal, in some places, one looks at the historical buildings which are to be integrated in this kind of situation. But it's a tabula rasa situation. Whether in the city center or outside, this does not make any difference from my point of view. And it means that this is a flat piece of land without people as well. So there are no people anymore. And there may be the new structure, but for me, the main element is there's new population. There's new population coming in. And to integrate this population, on one hand, to establish social capital among the population is not so easy. Then when we see these developments in the closer in the city centers, of course, most of the population who had lived there before would not be even able to afford any property in these new high-rise buildings there. So they become very elegant. They become rather exclusive as well. If we go to the outskirts or at the less privileged areas, we see more a different social strata, I think, as well. But to create integration and social capital between these people who come somewhere is extremely important. And therefore, I referred as well to these examples from Europe, where during the planning process, the participation and the integration in the development issues of the newcomers, there was some kind of ownership creation. And I think that's a very important point to achieve, that the people feel at home, that they feel that their neighbors are worthwhile to talk with, to do something with, and to create a new neighborhood. So for me, it's more, of course, the infrastructure and the built-up structure is clear. But for me, the main challenge is the social issue here.
Thank you very much, both Anne and Bernhard. I will leave the floor to Francesca for a question on her side. Please, Francesca.
Okay. I have a question or a comment or a doubt for Anne. Thank you so much for your presentation, and I look for your book in the next month. When we start our research, we discuss a lot about the meaning of new town. As you know, in China, there are different kinds of new town. Jian explained to us, I don't know, million of times that there are new town, new district, new area, and so on. And then we arrive we decide to stop this discussion and to say, well, we use a very broad definition of new town, new planned settlement as your first definition, and we look at what could be considered a new settlement where something happened. We use this very broad definition. So for example, our case studies are new district, new area, something like that. Not only places labeled as new town. I don't know. I don't know if this is a problem or a dilemma that we have only in China, or if this is a problem or a dilemma that we have to face in other places, in other countries, because in China it's very hard to find the right way. And then also starting from a question from the audience, there is the problem of the relation, as we all know, between urban and rural, in particular in China, in particular affecting the people, not in particular the place, but the people. And the question is more or less in which ways the new or the urban or the new town or something like that could be an opportunity not only for urban population but also for rural population. Is only a matter of urban people, or is related even to the improvement of the living condition of the for rural population? In our work, we have collected some data about that, and the change in living condition for rural population in the period of the rapid urbanization in China is very, very important. There is, for example, a strong reduction of infant mortality. There is the diffusion, the spread, of different kind of opportunities and so on. Of course, there is a gap. I don't know if the city can, or the new town can help to reduce more this gap, but we have to think more about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You've asked actually quite a lot of questions. I think I've found about 4 in there, so I'll try and quickly answer them. So yes, defining a new town is a vexed subject matter. But what we tried to do in the New Town book was look at those places that were comprehensively developed so that you could carry out all the activities of daily life within that new town. And so that precluded some largely industrial areas and largely residential areas where people commute in and out as part of their work life. And that's because we were really interested in how to have a sort of more sustainable urban form, to have a sort of cohesive social unit, to have something that's in ecological balance, to have something that's can survive economically. But of course, our cutoff at 30,000 was sort of arbitrary. It is Ebenezer Howard's size for a garden city, but we had to find a place. So that leads me to the second point, that there's lots of sizes of these kinds of developments, and there are various flavors. For instance, sometimes you could take a small city and expand it so half of it is new. Is that a new town? Some of the British new towns were really expansions of previous towns. Which brings me to this issue of urban and rural. When we talk about the urban, for many places, it's any settlement over 2,000 people. Sometimes it's 5,000 and sometimes it's 20,000. So many places that you actually think of as rural are actually urban in the kind of the statistical sense. And I think whether or not it's a new town, having comprehensively kind of developed areas with a sort of range of social infrastructure is a positive thing. And there's a long history of creating smaller sort of new town developments for economic development purposes. They're actually all around the world, sometimes to do with resource extraction, agriculture, mining, and sometimes to do with other topics. So certainly I think that they could, a new town or a new village could have could be important for rural areas. And just thinking about that idea of comprehensiveness could help expand existing rural centres. I do want to say that China is a very divided place. Some parts of it are economically like Europe, and other parts are economically like some of the less well-off parts of India. And so it's very hard to have a one-size-fits-all perspective, given China's huge economic and social diversity in terms of particularly the sort of the economic dimension of what's happening. But I suppose I want to say that I don't think new towns are a solution for everything, but they do have lessons. And particularly as many people will be moving in the coming century, if only because they're climate refugees of various sorts, drawing on the lessons of new towns in creating new social environments, some of which did it better than others. And it was often not a physical process, but a social process within the new town when it succeeded. That drawing on that experience will help settlements of a variety of sizes to do better in this coming century when there's going to be great mobility. I hope that answered all 4 questions.
Thanks. We have time for one more question. I would like to address to Bernhard a question from the audience that is concerning the present difficult situation we are experiencing around the world. So for Bernhard, I read, concerning the reaction in response to the COVID-19, China set a paradigm to face the sudden global crisis. I would like to ask which reaction and approaches that we took during this quarantine period might advance or affect urban planning. In particular, they ask historic district renewal process, and I can assume is density, is concentration of population, of course. But I remember a discussion at the end of the Shenzhen Biennale this year where you talked exactly about this topic, city and pandemics. So if you have some new reflection to share today, this can be a kind of concluding question. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think actually China did extremely well in coping with the crisis. If we look at it, we were participating in several initiatives as a project as well, some project members as well, with UNDP, with UN Habitat and others, and looking into on one hand the dissemination, the expansion of the crisis within cities along the public transport facilities and so on, the areas, the housing areas related to that and so on. So from one point of view, one could say all this kind of central place theory implied way of thinking of planners may be not the best for avoiding such crisis and avoiding the spread of a pandemic, because we are trying to bring people together to use the same transport lines in big massive quantities. We bring them together at certain nodes and so on and so on. And this was exactly the expansion pattern as well, and distribution pattern, how the crisis developed in Wuhan. There were very interesting stories. On the other hand, we have to see that China has had a very effective system regarding the closeness and the possibility to control certain areas, whether we call them neighborhoods or blocks or whatever, with few entrances. So today we were talking opening these entrances. There are new publications coming up as well to put that trend on the table. Of course, for us, as we like to move freely, we like to expand our action radius, that's positive. On the other hand, we have to see that this point of the structure, the urban structure of Chinese cities was very helpful concerning the combat of the crisis. So to turn things down in a very consequent way. But on the other hand, yes, I think so. We have to rethink our planning concepts. We have to rethink, especially any let's say structure of public spaces. How are we going to construct them in future? To be able to have areas of retreat and segregation, but as well of communication. So I think this will be a very important point. But on the other hand, we urban planning, urban development can do a lot. But finally, and this is this we can see all over the world, it's the behavior of the people, which either supports the spreading or it diminishes it. And so this is something which we all can do. And urban planners, they can do, and urban designers, they can provide some good, favorable preconditions so that we feel at home as well in our place, even if we are separate, have to be separate. Of course, someone with a green small space around the house feels much better in such a time, and we have much less social conflicts than if we are enclosed in a 20 square meters room. That's very clear. So I think we have to take the lesson from that because it's finally the behavior of the people and not the almightiness of urban planners, regional planners, designers, and so on.
Thank you very much. I hope our discussion can continue another time in the future, maybe in person. For today, I think we can close our seminar after 4 hours of passionate conversation. So I would like to thank again Anne Forsyth and Bernhard Müller for their contributions. And I would like also again to thank my co-moderators, Francesca and Jian, and all the other speakers. I would as well thank the audience today, reminding to them that this event is in collaboration with Biennale Tecnologia, an event promoted by Politecnico di Torino that we start tomorrow. It is a program of conversation, events, lectures of 4 days till Sunday, focused on the relation between technology and society. You can find the program on biennaleTecnologia.it. And among the many events, one is dedicated to this exhibition, China Goes Urban. It will be Saturday at 3 p.m. And it is a dialogue in the exhibition rooms, showing the real exhibition, between Augusto Cagnardi, that is the architect of the Italian new town of Pujang, that was mentioned before by Bian Lanchun, and Francesco Carota, that is the scientific coordinator of the exhibition. So thank you very much again. See you very soon with the new events of China Goes Urban. We have still a program of conferences during November or December. So, and thank you very much again for today's participation. Bye-bye. Thanks to Anne and thanks to Bernhard.